Institute here at the Wilson Center. My role here is simply to introduce this event. For those not familiar with our work, this is the National Memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We convene some 800 events like this every year in trying to promote good public policy making by bringing scholars, practitioners. This is the vocation of this institution. This is what we do. The event today, Energy, Oils and Oil Sector Reform in the Americas, is a joint effort by 4 of our programs. The Latin American program, represented by its director, Cynthia Arnson, that will join us in a moment, and will be leading the second panel of this discussion. Andrew Silly from the Mexico Institute, who is going to chair the first panel on Brazil and Mexico. Cindy will chair a panel on Colombia and Venezuela. Also, it's important to recognize Kent Hughes from the Science and Technology American, the global economy, but in his capacity as the leader, the director of the Global Energy Initiative here at the Wilson Center. The Brazil Institute is also part of this. We have been running programs on energy for a while. The Mexico Institute has done more than a couple in recent months, last couple of years. The same with the Latin American program, the STAGE program, Kent Hughes program, and the Brazil Institute have run joint events on renewable energy. So we are building on something that is already we are engaged in. And the focus today is really to try to understand the regulatory frameworks in 4 major oil producers and 2 major oil exporters in the area, with a third one, Brazil, coming online to become probably a significant exporter, also along with Colombia in a sort of a smaller scale. With that, I would like to ask that practical issue, if you're using the translation, please tune into channel 13. I think that's right. And Andrew, it's yours.
Thank you, Paulo. Well, let's go straight into the first panel here. Without further ado, we're fortunate to have 2 very distinguished panelists with us who, know all of Latin America very well, but we're going to ask them to focus each on a different country, on Brazil and Mexico. Today, Chris Garman is the director of the Eurasia Group. He is the head of the Latin American practice there. He's widely published in academic journals. You have his bio here, so I won't read all of it, and is a PhD candidate at UCSD, one of my alma maters, actually. And Duncan Wood is, many of you have heard him at the Wilson Center before, is a distinguished scholar from ITAM, has worked on a number of issues, but in recent years has worked extensively on energy in Mexico, was the coordinator of the Red Mexicana de Energía, acting head of the Department of International Studies right now at ITAM, and we have put outside a copy of a publication called Oil in Mexico, Pozo de Pasiones, appropriately titled, which he wrote the prologue for, but also was, I would say, a leader in putting this thing together at all stages. So why don't we go in order, and Chris, why don't we start with you?
Great. Should I sit over here to do the...
Wherever's easiest for you.
Okay. Maybe just to...
Take maybe 20, 25 minutes. Yeah.
20, 25 minutes?
Yeah, how does that work?
Okay.
I'm going to shift 20 minutes is probably best. Yeah, let's shift this.
Where's the... Oh, here it is. Okay. Well, Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and speak in such a distinguished forum. It's a very prescient and timely moment for us to engage in this type of discussion. Not only for the region but Brazil more specifically. In looking at Brazil's oil outlook, I think that it's important first and foremost to kind of frame, the nature of the challenges and opportunities which policymakers face. And as I have in previous presentations, and I did so again, I think that the title is somewhat provocative and attempts to do such. Essentially, I think that Brazil is a country which has a very market-friendly exploration and production framework, in which is very conducive to private investments from international oil companies. And now policymakers have been confronted with the very important decision of how to develop the tremendous reserves and potentials for deep-sea discoveries that they discovered off of the pre-salt shelf. So I think that the issue in Brazil is it's almost the inverse of Mexico. Given a market-friendly framework, will policymakers change the rules of the game and the E&P framework in a manner that, as I provocatively put it, will kill the goose even before it begins laying the golden eggs. I think that the bottom line and the takeaway that I would like to, or at least the thesis I'd like to defend here, is that the answer is no. I think that encouragingly that there is a significant degree of maturity in Brazil's political institutions and policymaking process and political class as a whole, which makes that outcome unlikely. Nevertheless, I do think that politics will delay when the goose begins to lay those eggs, and it may very well lead those eggs to be a little bit smaller than they would have otherwise. So I think that there is an opportunity cost here, but I think it's more of an issue of, what is the speed and the extent to which Brazil will be able to attract significant private investments to develop these reserves, not whether, if they will do so. All right? When looking at kind of what the current framework is, and what the government wants first and foremost, and then we can discuss what is the government's proposal for the sector. But I think that just a few words here, just to be able to just keep everyone up to date in terms of where we're at before entering into some of these drivers. Essentially, when Petrobras made the discoveries, in Tupi and off of the pre-salt shelf, and essentially the government became aware of the tremendous potential for these reserves, which can total anywhere from 50 to 70 billion barrels of oil, and really transform Brazil into a significant oil-producing nation and exporter. The government essentially took the decision to put on hold any bid rounds for new blocks off of the pre-salt shelf. Brazil currently adopts a concession framework in which we have an independent oil and gas agency, the ANP, that manages the bid rounds. Whoever wins the bids, which are dictated upon a series of criteria, which includes the size of the signing bonus, therefore has the ability to explore those blocks and pay taxes on top of them, which vary from royalty taxes to a special participation tax on large fields. Right? The government essentially took the decision to hold all this process of new bid rounds in the sector, to conduct a reappraisal of the E&P framework, and essentially on a justification that Brazil's 1997 oil and gas law was drafted in the context of high exploratory risk and low oil prices, that the current environment in the pre-salt is one now of low exploratory risk and high oil prices. Therefore, the state has to recraft and reconsider the new E&P framework in a way that could potentially extract greater rents for production and potentially exert a little bit more control over the sector. This process essentially picked up steam over the course of last year. The government created an interministerial committee to draft a proposal, and everything came to a screeching halt with the global financial crisis. Essentially, the ministers that were delegated the task of drafting a proposal started to put out larger fires in dealing with the liquidity crisis, and in late fall of last year, and more broadly drafting anti-cyclical economic policies to be able to combat the current environment. But now that the dust is beginning to settle with the global financial crisis, and I think Brazilian, the Lula administration is a little bit more at ease, at least with the measures that were taken, they have come back with a vengeance, and this is going to be a top priority of the Lula administration to approve a new E&P framework for the oil sector in the second half of the year. I think that this is, more broadly, I think that, a couple words in terms of, the nature, also to qualify the nature of the challenges. I think that this is important to note that one of the difficulties of crafting a new E&P framework for the pre-salt is that it will be conducted in a time where the geological and technological challenges for extraction still remain very large. But the political incentives for the administration to be able to approve a new legislation before the end of Lula's mandate is high. In other words, the political calendar is at odds with the geological calendar. And so how is it that policymakers can try to strike a balance over how to extract greater rents in a context where they don't know exactly what are the costs of production is a key issue here, and that certainly can generate some concern and is generating some concern for investors. Petrobras has made claims that extraction is profitable at $40 per barrel in the pre-salt, but I think that there is a case to be made that we should examine those with a large grain of salt, and no pun intended. But essentially, looking at the what the government wants, I think that there is an issue. Why is it that the government wants to change the current rules of the game? Because if the government wanted to simply increase extraction of revenues from oil production, I think that there is a case to be made that you can simply just increase the taxes under the current regime. Why change the whole E&P framework? And I think that the answer is that it's a mixture of strategic and strictly ideological purposes. I think that on the one hand, the government, sits a little bit ill at ease with the fact that they are bound by an E&P framework that was crafted during the Cardoso administration. This is an administration that I think does believe that want to have a little bit more strategic control over the pace of production. There is also a significant concern within government that the attractiveness of these new deposits was so large that essentially the government was not going to be able to ensure that Petrobras, Brazil's state-owned oil company, would be able to maintain a leadership role in development of the sector. In fact, that was one of the main players that lobbied the government to be able to halt, the new E&P bid rounds was precisely Petrobras, on the fear that international oil companies that were more capitalized or more desperate for reserves would snatch up all of the concessions that would be put up for bidding. So I think that there is a strategic component here, which the government not only wants to extract greater rents, but also wants to have a little bit more leeway in dictating the pace of investments and also ensuring that Petrobras will maintain a leadership role, which is a leeway that they do not have under the current framework. There's also, I think, a strictly political driver here, which is that the Lula administration is ending. Lula is in a dogfight to try to elect his preferred candidate, Chief of Staff Dilma Rousseff. She has never run for office. She's not charismatic, and I think politicizing the issue of oil will generate political dividends to the administration. So I think that's something that is favorable to it. And there is another strictly strategic component, which is often underestimated, which is that the government also wants to centralize the proceeds of revenue from oil production. Brazil's 1997 oil and gas law was legislated in a context where policymakers didn't feel that Brazil could become a large oil-producing nation, and as a result, the distribution of revenue from taxes is very decentralized. Let me just forward here out of order, but let me give you a snippet here of the proceeds from the special participation tax, which is a tax on very large oil fields or royalties. We see here that state and local governments receive around half of the proceeds from royalties and special participation tax. And of the state and local governments, the state of Rio de Janeiro receives the lion's share, the dark blue column here in that. So I think that as Brazil becomes a major oil-producing nation, that this distortion in the distribution of revenue from taxes will be greatly exacerbated. It is not at an equilibrium. So there needs to be some new legislation to change that distribution criteria. So I think that when we look at, that there were a number of reasons, therefore, that would lead policymakers to be able to introduce a new E&P framework. So what's it going to look like? I think that the parameters of the government's proposal have been very well aired in the press. I don't think we're going to get tremendous surprises, but I think that it's important to highlight there are really three controversial debates which have been shaping the government's proposal. The first is essentially how to structure production sharing agreement contracts. I think that the decision within government to migrate from a concession framework to a production sharing agreement contract framework has already been taken. Essentially, the government, rather than receiving rents from oil production in the form of taxes, would rather receive rents as a parcel of production. So you can have companies bidding for contracts, but they would have to reserve a parcel of that production to the government, which would be represented through the creation of a new state-owned oil, a state-owned enterprise that would sign and manage these PSA contracts. It would not be a company that would compete with Petrobras operationally, but it would be essentially a vehicle by which to be able to receive rents from production. And notice that this serves the strategic purpose of centralizing federal revenue in the federal government. Because by creating an SOE that receives a share of production, right, and that is managed by the federal government, you are essentially centralizing revenue from oil production via the back door without having to have a very open debate in Congress over a new distribution of revenue from taxes. Politically, it's easier to get that approved because you sell it on the version of a nationalism banner, that the oil is ours, which is a politically charged slogan in Brazil as it is in many countries. Right? I think that the main debate within government is less on whether to move towards a PSA contracts, but how to do so in a way that will give it flexibility to ensure that Petrobras will maintain that leadership role. So in contrast to some of the press stories that came out last year, this is a very Petrobras-friendly proposal. Because I think the government essentially would like the leeway to be able to either conduct competitive bid rounds in signing PSA contracts, and most likely the format that will take is that whichever company is willing to give a larger share of production to the state will win that contract, and Petrobras and IOCs could compete on equal footing. But it would like to have the criteria to be able to say that certain strategic reserves we need not put up for competitive bidding, and we can sign those contracts with Petrobras, i.e. it will give the leeway that they do not have today. Right? But legally, it's very complicated and not trivial as to how to do so without violating the Constitution. And I think that the government also does recognize that they don't want to undo the credibility that Brazil has earned in the E&P framework more broadly. I think that the other decision is how to unitize reserves in the Santos Basin. A lot of this is a map here of the Santos Basin and the 2P cluster, where a lot of the major reserves have been discovered. And I think just to move here, a lot of the reserves in the Santos Basin, they're probably sitting on fields which extend beyond the boundaries of the concessions that were awarded to the companies. And so one of the challenges is how are you going to strike unitization agreements, i.e., you can't have production beginning on a field and drain reserves which are an empty acreage and belong to the federal government. And that is a legal impasse. The current framework would essentially stipulate, all right, you get this area, you put it up for competitive bidding, the new companies come in, and they come to an agreement over how to produce jointly and explore jointly that reserve. But given that the government doesn't want to move forward with the concession framework, the issue is, well, how are we going to unitize? Right? And so I think that is a legal impasse that the government also wants to overcome. And so by creating a new SOE, they would like to strike these unitization agreements. And the proposal on the table from Petrobras is essentially to get those reserves that belong to the federal government, value them in some form or fashion, and capitalize Petrobras with them. Again, another Petrobras-friendly proposal. And I think that the third debate here is not only do we want to create a new E&P framework for new production, but also should we raise taxes on existing concessions? The bottom line answer is that last year they felt that they could, and they were willing to propose it. This year they aren't, in part because of the lower oil prices, and I think that there is more moderation within government. But nevertheless, I think that is a strategic ace in the hole that the government can have as it makes its way through Congress. Right? Just to kind of, getting to the meat of how all of this is likely to play out. I think that one of the difficulties, I think the first point to call attention to, I think it's unlikely that the government will be able to approve their full proposals before the end of Lula's mandate, although it's a very close call. That's why we put a scenario here where the government approves everything at only 45%. And why is it that we hold to that appraisal? First and foremost, the government is running out of time. The 2010 presidential election is coming next year. Congressional activity usually comes to a halt or significantly slows down in the year of a presidential election cycle. This is a reform proposal which will have significant repercussions for Brazil's long-term growth trajectory, which have significant repercussions in terms of distribution of federal, state, and local revenue around oil production. And to be able to juggle all those balls in a shortened political calendar is no easy task. Again, I think that one of the main debates within government will be how is it that they can reconcile the competing revenue needs between all levels of government. Producer states, which are the main beneficiaries of the current revenues, will fight to be able to keep their current privileges. Non-producer states are looking to have a much larger share of the pie. And the federal government will also want to centralize that revenue. While PSA contracts is a politically interesting, convenient way to centralize revenue, certainly producer states will be well attuned to that and will try to be able to extract greater rents from production as the proposal makes its way through Congress. Under normal conditions, it would be possible to juggle those in a context of plenty. But in a context where the opposition is in a dogfight with the government, it means that they will oppose the government on this proposal much more wholeheartedly, particularly given that the opposition is embarked upon a strategy to try to weaken the government through a parliamentary investigation over Petrobras, that they opened a CPI, a parliamentary investigative committee, to be able to examine allegations of corruption within the management of the company and indirect means of financing PT campaigns through the use of Petrobras. So oil politics has become a very large political football, and it means that the room for dialogue and a technocratic dialogue with the opposition over oil reform has also diminished. Right? So I think that in that context, I think what's likely to happen is that the government may very well get something approved, and this is our second scenario here, but it will be a watered-down version of the reform. Right? If they aren't able to approve all the PSA frameworks, I think that what they will do is restrict their reform only to trying to resolve the unitization impasse. Right? But it also means that if the government does get a new legislation approved, right, the quality of the reform may be less market-friendly and favorable to companies. And the reason, again, goes back to this distributive struggle between producer and non-producer states. We think that one likely outcome is that if the government can't negotiate with the opposition on this proposal, that most likely they will be held more hostage to the votes from the producer states. And what do the producer states want? They want higher taxes on existing concessions, or they want higher taxes on new production. So it means that the government, in a tight political calendar, will probably have to pay a higher price in terms of a less market-friendly version of the reform in order to be able to get it approved. So here I think that either we're faced in one of two scenarios. If the government is able to get a legislation approved in Congress, it will most likely be seen as somewhat excessively onerous to investors, and it will raise concerns that Brazil is killing the goose before it lays the golden eggs. If it does not get it approved, essentially we're punting a lot of the main regulatory decisions to 2011 when the next president assumes office. Right? Now, I think it's important to note, however, that that evidently if you look at these different scenarios, this is not very good news for the oil sector. It means that companies that are desperate to come to Brazil are probably not going to have significant opportunities, or current players may have the risk of higher taxes on existing concessions. For Petrobras, I think that the driver is positive, but as the proposal makes its way through Congress, it also presents some downside risks to the company. Right? And so what that means is that when we look at Brazil's future production, right, and here, when we look at Brazil's future production outlook, that the pre-salt really starts to kick in effectively beyond 2014. What it means is that if either we're stuck in a legislative process where there's no clarity to the investors to coming in for new E&P activity, that the rate of increase in production beyond 2014 may be partially impacted. All right? But the good news, however, is, and this is something that I want to end more on a positive note, is that if in fact policymakers do overshoot in taxes, I do think that whoever wins office in 2010 will most likely be pragmatic enough and to be able to roll back on certain potential overshooting. I think that the Canadian example is an illustrative one in which you may have overshooting on taxes, but some pragmatism ultimately at the end of the day. But from Brazil's energy outlook, I think it is important to highlight here from these graphs that I think that the issue is less whether or not Brazil will become an increasing oil-producing country, but how much it will be. Because these are projections that Petrobras, for example, makes on current concessions. In other words, you have a very favorable production outlook even if you don't give new E&P opportunities for IOCs in the pre-salt province. And that's part of the problem. There's a little bit of complacency going on because from the policymaking perspective, it's not as if that they're significantly pressured to be able to really attract significant sums of private investments, particularly because you're still facing a relatively favorable production outlook if you just rely on Petrobras alone, which will continue to be relatively well managed. Anyway, those are my my main conclusions here. But I think it's a story, that I would say on a concluding note is that it does reinforce. I think it doesn't diverge from a very positive investment outlook for Brazil, but I think it's more one of how politics can potentially reduce some of the potential upside to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. We'll proceed with Duncan, actually. Do you have a PowerPoint as well?
I do, yes.
You do. I'll stay over in the corner here.
Good afternoon. Good to see you all. Great pleasure to be back at the Wilson Center. I'm afraid my voice is a little bit croaky this afternoon, so bear with me, please. My brief this afternoon is to talk about the possibility for further oil reform in Mexico in the near future. And by the near future, I'm thinking between now and 2012, 2013. As most of you are aware, we had a package of oil reforms or energy reforms that went through Congress in 2008, which most people accept are inadequate, insufficient, and generally rather the term I use as asphyxiated or asphyxiadas, suffocated, as it turned out. What I want to do is I want to give you a little bit of the background of the energy and oil situation in Mexico before moving on to three scenarios which I see are possible for the future. Okay, so to sum up what we know about the oil situation in Mexico right now. Rapidly declining oil production. The finances of the national oil company Pemex are an absolute disaster, and this is a pending issue which nobody really wants to deal with right now, but it will appear on the horizon very, very soon. As I said, the reformas asfixiadas, the suffocated reforms of 2008, we have great uncertainty over what the new contracts are going to look at, which are coming out any day now for Pemex, in how they will work with private and foreign oil companies in exploration and production. And, of course, the political uncertainty generated by the elections, the midterm elections that took place this weekend on July 5th on Sunday. All right. Now, I'm not expecting you to see those figures there on the right. That's just a page taken from Pemex's website. But the basic story of Mexico's oil production is of a very rapid and very dramatic implosion of oil production, led by the implosion of Cantarell, the giant field that has supported Mexican oil production and drove it up to its high point of almost 3.4 million barrels a day back in 2004. Cantarell's implosion, if I can move forward 2 slides here, you can see this is how Cantarell has declined, coming down from its high point of over 2 million barrels a day back in January of 2004, coming down to 853,000 by the end of last year. We're now below 700,000 barrels a day. And if you see the numbers just for this year, how Cantarell's production is declining, it's increasingly rapid. Now, that will level off at some point. But Cantarell has ceased to be the goose that was laying a golden egg for us in Mexico. Cantarell is still significant. I mean, that's a lot of oil to be producing. I mean, 700,000 or 650,000 barrels a day is a lot of oil, but it's nowhere near where we were just a couple of years ago. The fields that are being proposed to replace Cantarell, Kumalubzap, KMZ, and Chicontepec, are inadequate replacements, largely because they simply can't generate enough oil quickly enough to replace the very, very quick and an enormous production of Cantarell. Kumloob Zap has been racked up very, very rapidly in terms of its production, and it is seen as a success story, and it recently surpassed Cantarell as being Mexico's largest producing field. However, the estimates are that within a few years, Kumloob Zap will begin to decline as well as it reaches its peak production. And even when it reaches its absolute peak, we're not expecting it to go much beyond 750, 800,000 barrels a day. Chicontepec currently produces 30,000 barrels a day. It is the big gambit, the big gamble on the part of the Mexican government. The idea is to drill in Chicontepec. It's a very, very complex, geologically speaking, field in which there are thousands and thousands of small pockets of oil where you have to drill a well. You extract for around 6 months. The well dries up or the pressure decreases, so you can't extract any more oil that is efficient or profitable. And so you move on to the next hole. The Mexican government is currently drilling, or Pemex is currently drilling, over 1,000 wells a year on the Chicontepec field alone. Now, the total number of wells that has been drilled over the last 30 years in Mexico is less than that. Over the last 30 years, they've drilled less than 1,000 wells in Mexico. And every year from now until 2020, Pemex plans to drill over 1,000 wells. This is an enormous engineering and logistical project that involves serious implications for local politics, local development, the environment, etc. It's very, very complicated, it's very expensive, and you do not get an enormous amount of oil out of there. As I said, they're currently producing 30,000 barrels a day. The plan is that by the end of this year, they might be able to get up to 60,000 barrels a day. They're hoping that by 2015, 2016, Chicontepec may be producing 600,000 barrels a day. That's rather optimistic, but it may happen. But even so, you can see that will not replace the decline of Cantarell. The only real replacement that's possible for Cantarell is deep water exploration and production, and Pemex lacks the technology and the know-how to be able to do it effectively. Part of the reform package last year was supposed to be an opening up of Pemex to allow Pemex to work with foreign oil companies to let them have access to the technology and the know-how to be able to go effectively into deep water. Pemex has gone into deep water on its own. It's drilled 8 wells in deep water, only one of which has begun to produce, and produce on a very disappointing level. There is a lot of oil in Mexican deep waters in the Gulf of Mexico. The problem is we just simply can't get to it, and when we can get to it, we can't get the oil out. And so we move on to the possibility of service contracts. Why are service contracts important in the Mexican context? Because of the constitutional restriction allowing only Pemex to go in and to extract oil and to maintain ownership of that oil. Pemex cannot sign a risk-sharing contract with a private oil company, which would essentially allow them to go in as a joint project with a private oil company or a foreign oil company where they would split the production that comes out of that. Pemex is not allowed to do that because of constitutional restrictions. So because of service, the other possibility is a service contract, which has been used extensively over the last 30 years, where private companies come in, perform a service with Pemex, and they receive a payment for that. But in order to go into deep water, and in order to go into many of the other fields that Pemex wants to develop, you need to provide them with some kind of incentive to go in there. So some kind of performance-based contract where they receive a bonus if they discover significant reserves of petroleum. And that's really what's tricky right now. Just to show you the overall crude production figures from Mexico. This is the decline that you can see here from 2004 to 2009, from 3.4 million barrels a day down to around 2.6 million barrels a day in 2009. And you can just see month by month this year already, up to May, how we've come down from 2.68 to 2.61, more or less, million barrels a day. This is a very rapid decline. It's a very rapid decline that means has a very big impact on government finances, on the finances of the company, and of course on the overall state of the Mexican economy. I'll just move rapidly beyond the Cantarell numbers. Let me talk about the finances of Pemex. For many years, people have speculated about how bad Pemex's debt situation is. Well, all you have to do is actually to look at the Pemex's own website, and you can find out. Pemex has been treated as a cash cow for many, many years. It has been stripped of its profits by the government in taxes and royalties. These have been taken to finance government programs by the federal government. Up to 40% of government revenue actually comes from Pemex. And this dependency on the part of the federal government on Pemex has meant that Pemex has been left with very, very little money in order to develop technology and to engage in the activities it needs to maintain its current production levels. So that's really the heart of the problem there. And some people speculate that if you actually let Pemex have more money, that Pemex would be able to fix the problem on its own. I'm actually not so optimistic about that. My belief is that it's not just a question of money. In the long term, absolutely. If you let Pemex have a lot more money, Pemex would be able to develop the technology, Pemex would be able to develop the know-how. But if you want to solve the problem of Mexican oil production in the short to medium term, you need more than just money. One of the issues that came up recently in the Mexican press was the question of Pemex's debt and its pasivo laboral, which is basically all the liabilities it owes to its workers through the rather generous contracts that the union has been able to negotiate over the years. And if you look at Pemex's financial statements, you'll see that Pemex's assets, and these numbers are in pesos here, Pemex has assets of 1.247 trillion pesos and liabilities of 1.134 trillion pesos. So we're getting close to a situation right now where Pemex is going to be in the red. Now, this is not a good situation, and the only way to really rectify this is either through dealing with the union somehow, which is really a taboo situation and very, very difficult to deal with. And if we look at what people have suggested over the past few years, really nobody wants to touch the union. Even though everybody recognizes it has to be done, nobody actually wants to do it because it's so politically sensitive. Or alternatively, to greatly increase Pemex's reserves. If you can increase Pemex's reserves, then all of a sudden its assets boom, and we see a much more positive scenario there. The Reformas Asfixiadas of 2008. Well, we saw that there were changes to the governing board of Pemex, producing a balance that's much more favorable to the government, much more favorable to an effective and efficient running of Pemex. There's more flexibility, the new contracts, which I'll talk about in a second. Regulatory changes, the creation of a Comisión Nacional de Hidrocarburos for the first time, an independent, autonomous commission that will regulate oil and gas prices in Mexico. Now, this is significant because up until this point, Pemex has more or less regulated itself in conjunction with the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Finance. Now we actually have an independent, autonomous regulatory body that should provide some limits and also incentives for Pemex. Why is this important? Well, it's really important actually thinking about the long term. If Mexico ever gets to the point, or when Mexico eventually gets to the point where it's willing to open up to the private sector, to allow private and foreign oil companies to come in, you need to have an independent regulator. Otherwise, people are going to be very, very afraid of going in there, given the dominance of Pemex in that market. In the reforms of 2008, there was also a small provision for the renewable energy sector, which I'll be happy to talk about later on, because it is actually quite exciting, even though what was proposed last year is actually very disappointing, but the potential is enormous. So let's talk about contracts, because I think this is something new that I haven't spoken about here at the Wilson Center before, and it is actually very, very important. It's very timely because of what's going to happen this month. As I mentioned to you earlier on, it's impossible to sign a risk-sharing contract with Pemex. Because the oil is Mexican, it belongs to the Mexican state, you cannot share the outcome, the results of the production. Let's say that a private company comes in and says, we're willing to put up all the cash. All we want is for Pemex to be a partner with us, that you actually don't have to do anything, and we will split the oil 50-50. Sounds like a really good deal. You can't do it. The Mexican Constitution actually prohibits you from doing such a thing. And so if you can't have risk sharing, you need to create something that will substitute for that in order to attract the right kind of foreign or private firm to come in there that can give you the technology, give you the know-how to be able to go into these very difficult areas of oil exploration. So the model that is about to come out from Pemex, this model for a new service contract, has been described by the executive advisor to Jesus Reyes Robles, the CEO of Pemex, as risk-sharing and production-sharing arrangements are still not legal by constitutional standards in Mexico. But the performance-based contracts try to emulate risk-sharing and production-sharing without violating constitutional restrictions. So, what are we talking about? I guess we're talking about a huge cash payment if you discover an oil bonanza. What's the difference between that and giving them the oil? Well, I mean, you depend upon oil prices, I guess, and there's ways to link that into the oil prices, etc. There's a way to link it into tax levels, etc., etc. But this is what Pemex has really been struggling with, and this is what the government has been struggling with, is if we cannot have risk-sharing and production-sharing agreements, then how do we actually incentivize private sector involvement in E&P in Mexico? Key questions that come out of these new contracts when they emerge is, how will they perform? Will they be attractive enough to bring in private and foreign firms? And it's a big if, because the Mexican regulatory environment is not the most certain in the world. It's not the most stable, particularly what we're going to talk about in a second, the political scenario. And second question here, how will the Congress react to these new performance-based contracts? There could be a very vehement and violent political reaction to them, given the fact that Mexicans still feel very, very strongly that oil belongs to the state. That is a question of sovereignty. If you are basically doing the same thing as sharing the production through an alternative means of payment, then will Mexicans have a gut reaction to this? And I'm not actually talking about people on the street. What I'm talking about is the politicians and the elites, of course. And given the fact that we've just had an election, a midterm election in Congress, in which the Congress has completely changed color, is that a problem? Well, as always, timing is an important issue here. I wonder, and maybe this is a rhetorical question, but I wonder if the timing of releasing these contracts is intentional by the government. You've just had an election. In other words, the Congress is not sitting and will not take its place until the fall. Therefore, you get these contracts out there, people get a chance to react, to say what they need to say before the deputies come in and take their seats. So hopefully this will be a political storm that will wash away before the new Congress takes position. Let's talk about the elections of this weekend. You see on the right a very, very happy Beatriz Paredes, who was speaking here at the Wilson Center just a couple of months ago, I understand. Well, she is happy. She's rubbing her hands with glee at the prospect of all the great little goodies that she's about to get for herself and for her party. What we have is predominance in the Cámara de Diputados, whereas in the previous Congress that has just left, we had a majority, not an absolute majority, but a largest party of the PAN, which is the same party as the presidency in Mexico. We actually have switched completely now. And we have a PRI, which was decimated in the last round of congressional elections, has come back with a vengeance, more than 200 seats. And if you combine that with the Green Party, the Partido Verde, the PVEM, then all of a sudden we see that they combined, when they form their alliance, will have an absolute majority. That creates a formidable political force that may or may not cooperate with the executive branch. And that's a key question. Now, in the past, in the previous Congress that began in 2006 through to 2009, the PRI did in fact collaborate with the executive branch. They collaborated to form an alliance on the question of energy reform with the PAN, which allowed the very watered-down version of energy reform to go through last year. And in fact, Francisco Labastida in the Senate was a key player on this, a priista politician who recognized the importance of the energy issue. And he was a leading figure in getting the PRI to come on board with the PAN. What we have this time around in the Cámara de Diputados, however, is something slightly different. The leader of the PRI, Beatriz Paredes, has a really bad relationship with the leader of the PAN, Germán Martínez, which means that she is unlikely to work directly with Martínez, and she's going to go directly to Los Pinos, the president's residence, to negotiate with Calderón. There was a very nice quote yesterday in El Universal. ¿Cuánto le van a costar a Felipe Calderón los acuerdos con la primera mayoría, el PRI, después de que Beatriz Paredes y muchos otros líderes, agredidos en lo personal por Germán, no quieren ni verle la cara? How much is it going to cost Felipe Calderón to come up with agreements with the majority in the Congress, the PRI, after Beatriz Paredes and many other leaders have been personally aggrieved by Germán Martínez, and they don't even want to see his face? This sort of highlights the very personalized and deep schisms that exist within the Mexican political scenario right now. Well, given that context, what are the possibilities for coming up with some form of further reform on energy in Mexico? Earlier this year, Manuel Beltrones, who was the leader of the PRI delegation in the Cámara de Diputados, came up with an energy reform proposal. I've put up here in Spanish. You can download this from the PRI's website if you want to. I'm not going to go through all of it because most of it is just very, very vague. But there's one part that I do want to highlight, and that is in the second clause here. It says, yes to the modernization and strengthening of Pemex, preserving its fundamental character of property of the state and dominion by the nation of hydrocarbons. Now, that's a standard phrase in Mexican politics. But instead of saying that this has to be a monopoly, instead of saying that nobody else is allowed to participate, the PRI decided to put the term like this, which allows, possibly, potentially, for some flexibility in the interpretation of that. Now, of course, the next line down says yes to the co-responsibility of the executive and the Congress to nominate the councillors for Pemex, etc., etc., etc. Absolutely, that's fine. We all recognize that. But all of this proposal was designed to say the PRI is going to be the major player now in determining whether or not we get meaningful energy reform over the next 3 years. There's one last little clause at the bottom here which I'd like to point out. Elevar el contenido nacional, to raise national content. So even if we have the new performance-based contracts coming in, the PRI wants to make sure that national firms, private or public, have a greater role. And I think this is actually a very positive element to include here. Look at the experience of other countries, Brazil, for example, who have been very successful in building up their own national oil industries by insisting on certain levels of national content. So what I've proposed here is 3 scenarios, which I've named 1, the precipice, 2, paving the way, and 3, Titanic deck chairs. The baseline assumptions for all 3 scenarios, and I may be wrong here, but continuing decline in production, that could always be reversed by a miraculous discovery, a second Cantarell. Who knows? It could happen. Stranger things have happened. Oil prices will recover. They have recovered already, and my prediction is they will continue to recover over the next 3 years. The PRI believe that they can win in 2012. Absolutely they do. They believe that they can win the presidential elections in 2012, and they believe that they can maintain a majority in the Congress, which would mean that they will dominate Mexican politics for the next 6 to 9 years. La Bastida will continue to exert an influence up to 2012. How strong of an influence remains to be seen, but he is an insider. He's somebody who understands the importance of the oil issue. At the same time as that, however, there's little enthusiasm for reform. Mexicans don't want to talk about energy reform. They were exhausted by the debate last year, and they're happy it's all over. So if somebody does have the moxie to put the issue of energy reform on the table again, they're taking kind of a big chance, because the big issues are, of course, the economy, of course, the question of security, and, of course, the question of public health, the swine flu epidemic that we had this year. And nobody really wants to talk about energy, even though it is a huge issue. And then lastly, another assumption, Copenhagen of 2009. Calderón, who is a true believer in doing something about climate change, is going to go to Copenhagen. He's got his Fondo Verde, his green fund proposal, which he really wants to push there. But he's going to need to come back from Copenhagen. He's going to need to do something on renewable energy, climate change. In 2010, 2011, And we're going to see if possibly there's an opening there to push some form of energy reform. All right, let's talk about the scenario one, the precipice. The basic scenario here, PRE refuses to collaborate with the PAN. There are minimal achievements on modernizing PEMEX, if anything. The PRE protests against the new performance-based service contracts. Production falls further. Mexican crude exports decline. Already we've seen a massive contraction of Mexican crude exports. And meaningful reform can only happen at the very earliest point in 2013. Now, it may not even happen then. Why do I call this a precipice? Because basically this means that Mexico gets to the point of importing crude oil into its economy, which is a ridiculous situation for a country which has such huge oil reserves, before finally taking the leap into the unknown of opening up the oil sector to private and foreign involvement. Second scenario, paving the way. Remember, the PRE believes that they are going to win the election in 2012. Intense negotiation with Calderon, with the presidency, transitional measures in the oil sector to open the way for private and foreign participation, accepting, of course, the performance-based service contracts, possibly risk contracts, unlikely, I would say, but maybe at some point sort of preparing public opinion for the possibility of production sharing. And redefining this key phrase that I mentioned earlier on, redefining of de propiedad del Estado y dominio de la nación de los hidrocarburos. Basically flexibilizing that in some way, making it more open to say, yes, the state is still the owner of hydrocarbons, but who takes it out of the ground and who gets to sell it onwards? We can talk about what that actually means. And that's really where I think the most hopeful scenario lies. The third scenario, Titanic deck chairs, the ship's going down, let's move those chairs around on the deck. It's not going to change anything, the ship's still going down. Calderon comes up with his initiative post-Copenhagen. It's on renewables and energy savings and basically making Mexico a greener country. Within that package, there'll be some further reorganization of PEMEX, but it's not going to do anything. It really won't change very much at all. It'll have a minor impact on production, and so basically PEMEX will continue to decline in terms of production heading towards 2012. What do I believe will happen? Well, generally you always pick the third one. I didn't. I picked the first one. I think the first one is actually the most likely because I really don't see the political will there to create any kind of collaboration on energy reform between the PRE and the PAN. The impact of this will be dramatic, and I'm not trying to be a Cassandra here. I really do believe that we're looking at a bad situation in Mexican oil production. When and only when Mexico gets to the precipice of collapse in importing oil will real change happen. So what do we have to do? Well, within Mexico, and indeed I would say from the point of view of the United States, because this is an important issue given the current problems facing the country, need for continued pressure, public education, media awareness, and engagement of Mexican political elites, intellectual elites, to make sure the issue stays on the table. It's disappeared. People don't talk about it anymore, and this is a real problem as far as I'm concerned. So, although I'm incredibly pessimistic, I do believe that there's something that can be done here because at some point we will get the change. It will probably be in 2013, 2014, but when the time comes, we need to be prepared. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan. We're fortunate we have about 25 minutes for some discussion. We'll take a brief break before we move on to the next panel. And why don't we open it up for your questions and comments? And we'll start with our good friend and colleague, Joe Dukert, over here.
Duncan.
Yeah, if you can identify yourself, your affiliation, and wait for the mic because we have translation and interpretation.
Joe Dukert. I'm an independent energy analyst, also affiliated with CSIS. Duncan, I'm more optimistic than you are, as usual. I think that number 2 is probably the likely scenario, but that may be because I want it to happen. I wonder, it seems to me that a lot depends on the answer to 2 questions. Where does Peña stand on all this? And is Jesus Reyes Heroles secure as Director General of Pemex?
Take a shot at that? Yeah? Okay. Okay, thanks, Joe. Yes, you are. You're much more optimistic than me. And I really want to believe in scenario number 2. Believe me, I do. And I think that in a logical, rational world, that's what would happen. Because the PRI would be looking at dominating the country, and therefore they'd say, okay, fine, we need to pave the way for us to be the presidency. We do not want to face a fiscal crisis. We don't want to face a deeper economic crisis, so this is what we need to do. What I've seen of Mexican politics over the last 13 years or so is that, unfortunately, that doesn't mean that it's going to happen. Just because it should happen, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. Peña Nieto. If Peña Nieto is the most likely winner of the presidential elections in 2012, what is his position? He doesn't have a position. And that's really worrying, I think, but it's not completely unexpected. We don't have a presidential candidate yet, and the race will begin now to determine who the PRI's candidate will be. Right now, Peña Nieto has sort of kept out of the national issues. He's focused almost exclusively on his home state. He did begin to make appearances in this round of congressional elections, endorsing certain PRI candidates. But I think that now we're going to find out where he stands. My feeling is that what he'll do is he will consult with the leading experts within the PRI. And so somebody like Labastida will be a crucial advisor for him. And hopefully, he's a smart young man, and he will pick up on the problems that face Pemex's production, and hopefully will collaborate with his congressional party in order to make that happen, to pave the way for his presidency. The other thing that we can't assume is that the PRI is truly monolithic. It never has been. And so, just because we have a recognized leader, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to collaborate with them. And I think that that's a major obstacle as well. And so coming up with a truly unified party approach to energy reform is going to be tricky. Is Reyes Heroles secure in his post? My feeling is, yes, he is. He's generally recognized as being a very, very good administrator. He's done an excellent job there, and will continue to do that. Beyond 2012, no, I wouldn't say he's secure in that post. But he is administering the decline in an effective way. There was recently a piece that appeared in the press about some contracts that have been signed with foreign firms to drill on 13 fields across Mexico. And I got a call from a journalist from Oil Daily saying, what's the big deal here? Why is this so important? And I looked into it. It really wasn't important at all, and you wondered why the press had been reporting on it. And it was just simply because Pemex is drilling wherever it possibly can, getting scraps and drops of oil out of the ground to try to slow down the decline. It really is a desperate situation. And that's what's going on. It's desperation right now. Drill, 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 drill. Mexico is one of the few places in the world which is bringing in more rigs and more platforms and more oil engineers right now, whereas, over the past few years with declining oil prices, people have been sending them out of their country. They've been going to Mexico. Read the oil press on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and you see the flow of rigs coming south from the U.S. and Canada into Mexico. So I think that what he's done is he knows how bad the situation is, and I think he's doing everything he can to make things less bad than they are. And so I think he's doing an adequate job, and I think most people recognize that.
Let's take more questions. Cindy Arntzen, Director of the Latin American Program here at the Wilson Center.
Hi, Cindy Arntzen. Right on? Doesn't sound like it is.
No.
No? Okay. All right, we'll try that again. There. Does that work? Good. A question for Duncan. Yeah?
Yes? Okay, yes, it's
Okay,
on.
good.
Yes, they can hear you in the back.
Question for Duncan and also a question for Chris. Somewhat, the questions the reverse of themselves for each of you. Duncan, you seem to disparage the third scenario that you outlined by calling it rearranging the decks, the chairs on the Titanic. We're talking about oil production at a time when the world very much sees the need to move away from fossil fuels. So why isn't it an option for Mexico, rather than having all of these, agonizing debates over what to do in the face of declining oil, to start shifting more dramatically toward greener energy. And Chris, I guess the question is the reverse. Brazil has been a leader in the green energy market and technology and development, and only now will be moving in a hugely bigger way into oil production. Is there a recognition in Brazil of the downside of that, not only environmentally but also in terms of what countries have come to call the resource curse? The dependence on these export enclaves with few backward and forward linkages throughout the economy. I mean, how do you expect this might transform, the Brazilian economy in ways down the road that might not be that beneficial?
Back up first.
Chris, why don't you jump in?
Sure. That's a very good question. I think that they're really, I very much focus the nature of my comments on the policy challenge of whether or not the government will craft an E&P framework which will be sufficient to be able to attract investments to develop these reserves. Your question is more, what will they do? Given that they will attract investments in some capacity to ramp up oil production, then how are we going to manage this newfound wealth? That's an equally important challenge, which I did not address. I'm a little bit more confident on that side. I think that Brazil was lucky to have found oil after the development of well-consolidated political institutions, after creating a very sizable tax base in which you have a tax, like Brazil's tax take as a percentage of GDP is 35%. In Mexico, non-oil, revenue, generated from taxes is only 11% of GDP. Is very low.
And that's up.
And so that means that I think that it's very unlikely for Brazil to become dependent on the proceeds from oil production to finance current expenditures and generate a lot of the pitfalls that have been, in part because the development of the state has already occurred after the, prior to the discovery. And so I think that there's a debate within government of, reasonable debate to create some kind of sovereign wealth fund of sorts, which would follow the model in Norway, in which you would have an intergenerational component for the proceeds of oil production that would deposit it in to finance education needs or sometime medium-term development needs, right? So I think that there is a risk that you would kind of squander that money, but I think the government is also very well aware of the perils associated with financing current expenditures. I think that, the issue of industrial policy that's one facet. The second facet is how can you become less dependent upon primary exports. And I hear the government, I think, may err on the other side, that there's a very strong appraisal within the government to create an industrial policy around, the proceeds and these discoveries, to such an extent that they very much view they don't want to only export crude barrels. They want to be able to export refined products and therefore have, a downstream industry around that in refining and petrochemicals and all that. But in a context where, there's an oversupply of refining capacity, to invest heavily in refining with the pre-salt is a gamble. I think that it is pushing Petrobras to an enterprise which may take a little bit more risk from a business perspective. But I think that, and they very much want to ramp up domestic content requirements around that. So I think there is a view of an intergenerational component for spending from the revenue, and a view to develop an aggressive industrial policy around that. Now, so I think that, on that side, I think that's relatively good news. When it comes to renewables, I don't think the government views this as a zero-sum game. I mean, at the end of the day, the policymakers view this as a tremendous, asset to be able to help jettison and increase Brazil's growth potential. That by having an intergenerational fund, you avoid some of the Dutch disease, perils. I think the government is very concerned about an overvaluation of the currency that could lead to deindustrialization of the economy. I think that's well recognized. And with renewables, I think that that evidently Brazil is in the context where we're going to have significant potential and continued growth in ethanol production. And so, and that is a concern for Petrobras to the extent that consumers may rely upon ethanol rather than gasoline. And so I think that the Brazilians are looking to export gasoline as well. So that's the issue is where are they going to export it to? But I think that Brazil's promising renewable or at least biofuel outlook does make the whole issue of whether you're going to export crude oil or refined products and gasoline a tremendously important one, right? The government's clearly going on the strategy of trying to, export gasoline, which, from a business perspective, we're hearing from the sector is not a trivial one. It does come with some risks.
And by the way, as you're answering Cindy's question, also a question: is there any discussion in Mexico about a sovereign wealth fund when prices go back up again? Does anyone ever talk about that?
Okay. I'd echo some of the things that Chris has said. I think basically the situation in Mexico is that we depend so heavily on oil, and it should have been. It's been wasted in so many ways. The question of administering a decline. Remember, 30 years ago we were talking about the problems of administering wealth. I mean, the kind of thing that Brazil is contemplating right now. Our greatest problem will be administering the wealth. And it's a real lesson, I think, for other countries who are embarking on this similar trajectory to say, okay, just don't take it for granted. Do not assume that everything is going to go smoothly here. Well, we've depended on it. We haven't done what we needed to do with it. And now we find ourselves in a situation where it's declining. So, why is it such a big deal? It's a big deal because of government finances. It's a big deal because of employment. It's a big deal because Mexico's balance of payments will be affected by this once we have to start importing oil. Now, Mexico produces at the moment 2.6, more or less, million barrels a day. It's consuming around 1.5, exporting just around 1.1. But the estimates are that by between 2016 and 2020, demand will meet supply. Okay, and that's the key thing. It's that, yes, domestically, Mexican demand is rising rapidly. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it does matter what Calderon does. But even though we implement energy savings, new environmental standards, etc., because we're a developing country, demand for hydrocarbons is going to increase dramatically in the coming years as more and more people get automobiles, for example. I mean, the same thing as China, just to on a much smaller scale. And so we cannot, basically, we're not in a situation where we can replace that oil with renewable energy, particularly given the fact that we have invested so lightly in the renewable sector up to this point. I said earlier on that there's enormous potential there, and there is. I'm a firm believer in that. But we just simply are not in a situation to rack up, for example, biofuels, ethanol production right now, to provide even a supplement, a meaningful supplement to gasoline. And the export situation is really, really important. Even though in countries like Brazil that are going to become major oil exporters, it still makes sense to try to replace as much of your hydrocarbons with renewables if they're cheaper, because then you can export the higher value product. Now, whether you produce crude or gasoline is a dodgy question, because it probably makes more sense to export crude and let somebody else take the risk of refining it. But in Mexico, we're in a situation right now where we need to try to reduce the consumption, reduce the rising demand, in order to be able to keep up our exports, given the fact that production is falling. And so it's you have to put all of these things into the equation at the same time. And the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Mexico, people have been talking about this, to my knowledge, for the last 5 years. People always talk about Alberta and Norway. Nobody talks about Saudi Arabia for some reason. I don't know why. No, yeah. And it's always put out there as being a dream. Wouldn't it be nice? Shouldn't we have done this 30 years ago? Can we get into our time machine and go back? And as always, yeah, wouldn't that be lovely if we could do that? Is there the possibility with rising oil prices that we will be able to have a sovereign wealth fund? Very unlikely, given the fact that production is declining so rapidly. In fact, high oil prices by 2020 will be a bad thing for Mexico, because we have to import oil. So it's bad on both fronts there. But if we have a major discovery, if Tupi is discovered in the Gulf of Mexico, then who knows? Yes, anything's possible. But I would gamble that no, we wouldn't do it.
And if you discovered Tupi, would it happen even?
Yeah,
which is the other question, right? Yeah. Let's go back to your questions and comments. Luz Maria de la Mora. Very glad to have her here as a public policy scholar this summer, Luz Maria.
Thank you. This is a question for Duncan. Duncan, I tend to agree with your scenario. I think that scenario number one is basically what we're going to be seeing in the near future. I was wondering whether you could elaborate on the very labor union. The labor union will. Sorry. Yes. Just very quickly. Your scenario number one, I think it's viable and I think it's realistic what you're talking about, even if it's not the best scenario for Mexico. But I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the role of the labor union in that scenario. Because right now they're enjoying the profit of oil, but eventually they will be in a situation in which everybody will lose. Is there any creative situation or any creative position on the part of the union to encourage some kind of reform that will give some viability to the oil industry in Mexico?
Let's take 2 or 3 questions or comments before we go back, just in the interest of time. There was a hand up on this side. The gentleman down here.
Do I need the microphone?
Yes, because we have interpreters in the back, so it helps them to be able to hear. They're in a booth back there. We very much appreciate that. Right, the gentleman right here.
It's a very short question, but I guess I do need this. For Duncan, my name is Carlos Bacota, and I am a former State Department officer. And one of your slides, it had a list of things that Pemex was planning to do, or you saw Pemex doing, and you were very concerned about the traditional Mexican position about the, el petróleo es de nosotros, that kind of thing. But then towards the bottom, there was one in which it mentioned transparencia en los contratos con los particulares, which made it seem like the particulares were just like a normal part of this whole deal. And my question was, who are the particulares? How long have they been around? And wouldn't it just be a natural evolution that the particulares, whoever they might be, will play a much larger role, and it wouldn't be a heavy political battle? Because my feeling, knowing Brazil better than I know Mexico, would be that the particulares probably carry a certain amount of political clout, and we'll be able to figure this one out.
Okay. Let's take one more if there was anyone else wants to jump in before we close this round. Gentleman right here.
Mark Schlagenhoff, USAID. One of the reasons Mark Schlagenhoff, USAID. One of the reasons the Cantarell production was able to stay up so high was because of the nitrogen injection. And I'd previously worked at Poza Rica, and we looked at some water floods in the Chicontepec area. And obviously in the late 90s, at under $10 a barrel oil, it wasn't very economic. But I wondered, have you done any estimates of the potential for enhanced recovery of existing fields and how that would impact the outlook?
Let's go to our panelists.
Okay.
Duncan, why don't you start?
Okay. Luz Maria, nice to see you. The labor union, it really is the multi-billion-dollar question is how can you, it's not how can you, it's who's willing to actually stand up and then sit down with the union and say, let's talk. Because the union is in an enviable position where it really doesn't have to. It's protected, and it's protected with these really gold-clad, ironclad, gold-plated contracts right now that has led Pemex's finances, in part, to be so disastrous right now. And my feeling is looking into the future, into the crystal ball, is it will only really be once we get to the precipice where the union says, okay, finally we need to sit down, in the same way as the U.S. auto industry had to do so eventually. I think that's really where we're going to get to before anybody is willing to open up the Pandora's box, because it's brutal. And you think about Mexican politics today, and you think about how unions still play such a fundamental role. You think about the teachers' union, how something as corrupt as that could play such an important role, and openly an important role in Mexican politics. And so finding the individual, the political leader who's really willing to stand up to the union, such a powerful union that could have such a disruptive impact upon production and the economy, I don't see anybody who's willing to do that right now. It will only come, I think, when you get to that point where you say either Pemex is bankrupt or we're at that point where we have to start importing oil. And so that's when it'll happen. And it will depend upon having that person who even then has the guts to stand up to the union, I think. So pessimistic on that one. On that side, it was the pre-proposal energy proposal on and the mention of transparency. Of course, is that lovely word that we always hear over and over again. But a lot of Mexicans, in fact, say, well, what is this, transparencia en los contratos con los particulares? There's this big myth in Mexico that the private sector isn't involved in oil production. Of course it is. I mean, they're the people who actually do the work, or most of the work out there. It's just that they're on contract-based. And this is, you're absolutely right, this is where the PRI is preparing for an attack in some way on the new performance-based service contracts, to make sure that these are open and transparent so that we know exactly how much they're going to get paid. It's not to protect the private sector. This is to protect the nation from any kind of corruption that takes place with the private sector. We want to know exactly how much they're going to get paid for contracts, under what conditions, etc., etc. And I think that's where the PRI really have positioned themselves to attack the executive branch and Pemex on these new contracts. And so you're absolutely right. The private sector is there. The private sector plays a major role in the oil industry already. It was interesting last year during the oil reform debates. A number of newspaper articles came out. They said, but isn't the private sector already involved? And people didn't want to talk about it. It was very, very funny. There was a real denial of this reality. And there's still a belief in the public. And, I teach at a good university. My students are well informed. But when I had somebody in from Pemex to talk about the issue of sustainable development, and she was talking about the difficulty of dealing with, people, oil engineers from all over the world who come to Chicontepec and trying to teach them about sensitivities to local cultures and gender and issues like that. And they looked at her and said, what do you mean engineers from all over the world? Isn't it Mexicans who are doing the work? He says, well, there's some Mexicans there, but no, we use private companies from all over the world. There's foreign companies in Mexico. Of course there is. I mean, think of Halliburton, for example. And so, that's the reality. But I think that's what that little clause was in there for. It was to say, we're going to keep an eye on any contracts that come out of Pemex to make sure that the nation gets what is due to the nation out of this. And the question of enhanced recovery, really, really good question. I think that for Chicontepec it doesn't work so well because you have, they're very, very small pockets. That's the real problem here. So that even if you're able to get out your 50% or maybe even a little bit more of what's in the pocket of oil that's down there, it's over so quickly that is it really worth investing sort of that extra money to do that? Well, the answer is the government is already, or Pemex is already doing this. Pemex, I think, is going to be a world leader on this kind of geology by the time the Chicontepec project is over. And I think that there's a possibility for looking to the future. This may actually be something that Pemex has to offer to the global oil industry. It's how to deal with these difficult fields. I would actually say there's greater potential, though, for going back to old fields where there are still significant reserves that at the time when they stopped producing, it didn't make sense to go back to. And in fact, this is a discussion we've had in Mexico for a couple of years about, is there a possibility of allowing smaller producers who don't have all the overhead costs of somebody like Pemex or Statoil or whatever, to go in there and to say, I want this well. You've abandoned it. You've basically said you don't want this oil anymore. Let us get it out of the ground. We'll sell it to you afterwards, absolutely. But let us get it out, because we can do it cheaply. And what comes to mind is the idea of the small producers in Canada, in the United States, the mom-and-pop firms, who could maybe get out 10 barrels a day. But 10 barrels a day at $100 a barrel is pretty fantastic. And you could do that, and it could be efficient, and it could be effective. But right now, that's not going to happen, I think. But there are big wells out there, in the Gulf that have been closed off, that maybe it's worth going back to. And I think that is a question which is pending there. But for Chicontepec, enhanced recovery, I think Pemex is working on that. But how much are you going to get out? That's the question. If you are producing for 6 months from one well and you're working really hard to get that out, how much more effort do you want to put in there to get that oil out?
Chris, any final thoughts?
No, I think it's most of the questions were Mexico. That's great.
Well, great. Thank you to both of our panelists. A fabulous discussion. And let's take a 10-minute recess. Let's gather back here at 3:40, and we'll continue talking about Colombia and Venezuela. Let me... I hate to interrupt the clapping here, but let me, before you go, one quick reminder. Adam is reminding me that the next session will be in Spanish entirely, and so if you want translation or interpretation, there are headsets on the outside. Please grab one during the break. Now we can applaud our panelists.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
You were moderate in your moderation.
Moderate in the moderate. Very good. Non-intrusive. Chris, good to meet you. It's very UCSD person.
Huh?
You said we stepped backward, right? Is that
Yes, I did.
You guys, you did an article on decentralization.
That's right, with Liza Willis, yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. Okay, good. Read that, cited it.
Yeah. So that's right. He was my advisor. So.
Okay, good. Peter Smith was my master's. Well, actually, wasn't my advisor. He was my boss. I worked with him.
Because actually both worked. Peter Smith was my original advisor.
Really? Okay.
But I ended up working with Hacker a little bit more.
Okay, good.
Research.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a PhD candidate, but it's I guess 8-9 years ago. So
Okay, so you
I guess I should take that out of the.
Well, are you going to try and finish this somewhere, or you just decided
I
not
have
to?
potentials too.
Yeah.
I started consulting work like
My wife said
8
that
years
position.
ago.
Yeah. My wife's a PhD candidate at Tulane, but she's working at the IDB and American Investment Corporation for 9 years, I guess. So, that's sort of hard. It's not exactly
Internal ABD.
Yeah, exactly. Working with business, the business view is not necessarily compatible with.
I'd have to take time off and the requisites of sustaining a family and all that.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other element. Yes, I understand that. Good. Well, good to meet you as well. Likewise, yeah. And who's doing your Mexico work these days? Okay, at CIDA? CIDA, yeah, sure. I don't actually know her on that. I've spoken to her on the phone.
Oh, yeah?
So, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I know lots of CIDA people. Some we've never met. So, yeah, we have.
Yeah. No, she's very good.
You had Pam for a while.
That's
you
right,
had,
and Enrique Bravo.
Oh, Enrique Bravo was great. Yeah. Who's trying to finish the dissertation?
That's right. When he came for a job interview, I was just like, so you haven't written your dissertation yet, you realize that you're not going to be able to get it done if it's not working.
Yeah.
So disciplines, I've been working on the weekends, and just like, I gave up my pretensions about 4 years ago. And then, sorry enough, he's like, I need time, I can't.
Yeah. Which is good. I mean, he knows he wants to be an academic, or at least get the degree and stuff. Yeah, he's pre-family, so that's. So, we do have a break.
send this back on. Yeah, I did. Is it over here in the other room here?
No, I turned that one off.
Okay. Now this, you think that's enough battery? It's about half a battery. Should we throw another one in there? So we don't have.
Yes, in the afternoon when they want.
Check, check, 1, 2. Check, check, check.
thinking maybe it makes more sense for Ana Maria to go first, mostly for the language thing, because she'll be in Spanish, I think this attention's going to happen. No problem. Muy bien. Okay, all right. Great, we'll get started again if people could take their seats. Okay, my name is Cindy Arnson. I'm the director of the Latin American program here, and it is a pleasure to be collaborating with my colleagues from the Mexico Institute and the Brazil Institute on this program. If they haven't been thanked before, I don't see them in the room, but I'd especially like to thank Adam Stubbits, program associate with the Latin American program, and also Nikki Nichols of the Latin American program for their help in putting this event together. Our final two presentations of the day concern Colombia and Venezuela, which involve very different energy and especially oil scenarios. Venezuela is a major oil producer like Mexico, faces severe problems with having the technology to get known reserves out of the ground, although it dwarfs other countries in the region in terms of its current oil production. Roger, who will be talking about the Colombian case, will be looking at a country that had very declining known reserves over the last couple of years and has moved to privatize a good share of its oil sector and provides a very radically different model of oil development than the cases that we've heard about up until now, both of state-run and state-led oil development. Again, you have the bio, so I don't need to give an extensive introduction, but it is always a pleasure to have Ana Maria San Juan here with us at the center. Ana Maria is at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, has been writing on energy issues for several years, and is one of, I think, the most well-known analysts of Venezuelan politics, inside as well as outside of Venezuela. We welcome your remarks, Ana Maria. Roger, I think, is also known to many of us that have followed energy issues for some time. Roger used to be the lead energy consultant for PFC Energies here in town, and has moved back to his native Canada, where he has the luxury of being in beautiful surroundings as he contemplates these difficult issues, but is also the author of many publications on oil and on energy development. So Ana Maria will be speaking in Spanish. Those of you who need translation, I invite you to pick up a headset, and if you don't have one, I think there are a few others left on the table. Please make sure that you're turned to channel 13, and also that these little buttons are facing forward, and that'll assure, I think, the best reception. Okay, Ana Maria.
Thank you so much. Bueno, buenas tardes, para que puedan estrenar los aparatos de translación. Bueno, voy a hablar de un tema muy complicado para Venezuela, muy importante, pero muy complicado de trabajar y de analizar en Venezuela, debido a que es un tema sobre el que existe la más alta polarización en un país extremadamente polarizado, debido fundamentalmente, sobre todo, al uso del recurso energético dentro y fuera de Venezuela. Como antecedentes me parece importante tener en cuenta que incluso en este momento, más que en México, y obviamente más que en Brasil y más que en Colombia, el petróleo tiene una importancia en la vida económica y política del país desde hace un siglo. Y las disputas sobre el uso del excedente y del dinero y de los recursos petroleros en relación al desarrollo es una disputa que se extendió durante todo el siglo pasado y obviamente parte de este. Nuestra cultura política está organizada alrededor del petróleo y debido a que el Estado es dueño de los recursos petroleros, la política se hace en torno alrededor del Estado, y el que accede al poder en el Estado accede también al poder de manejar esos recursos petroleros. La opción predominante en el siglo pasado, sobre todo a mediados del siglo pasado, fue la encarnada por Acción Democrática, el Partido Socialdemócrata, y que tenía como predominio el manejo desde el Estado del recurso petrolero, para el fomento del desarrollo en el país y con una promoción del nacionalismo petrolero, cosa que no es nueva en Venezuela. Estamos viviendo hoy una etapa máxima de nacionalismo petrolero, pero esto comenzó a tener mucha importancia en el siglo pasado, sobre todo a mediados del siglo pasado, cuando Venezuela introdujo la ley del 50-50, 50-50, para el tema del pago de regalías e impuestos, y después con la fundación de la OPEP y posteriormente en el año 1975 con la nacionalización de la industria petrolera. Esta característica petrolera de Venezuela ha hecho que tengamos una característica de petroestado, con una debilidad institucional importante, con una vulnerabilidad institucional importante. Es el país de los 4 países analizados que depende en extrema medida de los ingresos petroleros, y eso tiene unas limitaciones importantes en el desarrollo del país y ha creado una economía de carácter rentístico en Venezuela. ¿Cuál es el actual contexto político del desarrollo del marco legal y del funcionamiento de la industria petrolera? Los nuevos actores políticos, los que ya tienen una década en el poder en Venezuela, tenían una agenda antagónica con el modelo desarrollado en los 90 de apertura petrolera, y según ellos, este modelo llevó al colapso de los precios del petróleo en el año 1998, año en el que un barril de petróleo venezolano se cotizaba a $7 por barril, en el momento en el que gana Chávez la presidencia de la República. Su propuesta fundamental en el área petrolera estaba contra el proceso de apertura, contra la pérdida de la relevancia económica de la faja del Orinoco, sobre todo en la denominación de lo que allí existe como reserva, y de la desvalorización de la OPEP como cartel. Los principios de la política petrolera bolivariana: el petróleo es el eje central de articulación a nivel nacional y a nivel de la política internacional. Es el fundamento para el desarrollo e industrialización del país y para crear, según explican, una nueva burguesía venezolana. Es la base del nacionalismo, de la nueva integración, de la seguridad nacional, del mundo multipolar y, obviamente, del antiimperialismo. Una de las partes muy importantes de la política petrolera lo ha sido la recuperación de la OPEP y el funcionamiento de Venezuela dentro de la OPEP. Obviamente también la recuperación de los precios del petróleo y el establecimiento de una banda de precios que tuvo efectos en la OPEP durante 2 o 3 años. La búsqueda de nuevos mercados para diversificación y reducción de la vulnerabilidad económica de Venezuela. Un cambio en la orientación de la industria en el exterior, es menos autónoma PDVSA a nivel internacional, y en lo interno también tiene menos autonomía y tiene una mayor contribución fiscal para el Estado. Es una empresa más política y que responde a la nueva legislación, donde hay un cambio en el modo de relacionamiento de PDVSA con el Estado, mucho más sujeto al ministerio que conduce esa industria. Hay un cambio en las relaciones con las empresas extranjeras. Vivimos 2 picos de nacionalización, uno en el 2007 y uno en el 2009, en el cual hay una mayor participación accionaria de PDVSA y un mayor pago de impuestos y regalías y nuevas leyes según cambie el ingreso y la cantidad del costo del barril de petróleo. Y hay un relacionamiento con nuevas empresas de la región, con casi todas las empresas de la región en materia energética y con empresas de Rusia, Irán, China, Japón, España y Portugal. El centro de la política petrolera lo protagoniza PDVSA. PDVSA en esta década tiene 2 denominaciones según las 2 etapas del manejo de la política petrolera, de la política energética. El primer ciclo fue entre 1999 y 2003, antes del paro petrolero, y desde el paro petrolero en 2003 hasta los momentos. En la primera etapa existe una recuperación del papel de Venezuela dentro de la OPEP y una recuperación de la OPEP como organismo para la fijación de precios a nivel internacional, una reversión de la apertura petrolera y la creación de un nuevo marco legal para el cambio del rol fiscal de la industria. Esto ocurrió en el marco de las leyes habilitantes del 2001. Entre 2003 y 2009, existe una nueva PDVSA, así se autodenomina, donde existe un cambio del marco fiscal con empresas, entre las empresas y el Estado, 2 etapas de nacionalizaciones, una etapa en el año 2007, que fueron unas nacionalizaciones que tenían que ver con la soberanía petrolera, y las nuevas nacionalizaciones que se han hecho de 79 empresas venezolanas en el año 2009, que son, estas nacionalizaciones están hechas por motivaciones económicas, y PDVSA tiene ahorita roles adicionales en el ámbito del desarrollo en Venezuela. ¿Cuál es la diferencia de PDVSA con el resto de las empresas analizadas aquí, fundamentalmente con Pemex y Petrobras? Pese a que las 3 son empresas públicas, hay una diferencia en relación a PDVSA, que PDVSA tiene una concepción estatal nacional con criterios no comerciales, sino estratégicos. Es decir, entre los negocios y la soberanía, priva la soberanía, y puede ser eventualmente tanto ideológica como pragmática, pero privan los intereses nacionales, no los intereses comerciales. Hay una nueva relación con el sector privado nacional e internacional y con las compañías extranjeras. La rentabilidad de la empresa se hace en función de los objetivos de desarrollo y de los objetivos nacionales. No existen solamente en una empresa como PDVSA podría darse el desarrollo de un consorcio como el de Petrocaribe, en el cual 18 países de la región, fundamentalmente de Centroamérica y del Caribe, han recibido el financiamiento de hasta 70% de la factura petrolera y de los derivados, según el precio del mercado internacional, y esto significaba una erogación para Venezuela entre 1.000 o dejar de percibir entre 1.000 y 2.000 millones de dólares. Además, PDVSA tiene unas nuevas atribuciones en el tema de la seguridad alimentaria, con la creación de PDVAL, que es una industria de alimentos, PDVAL agrícola, que fomenta el desarrollo del sector agroindustrial en el país, y la misión Rivas, que es una de las misiones educativas, de las 4 misiones educativas que existen. Hay un aumento de nómina importante y tiene operaciones con 25 empresas públicas y privadas en la faja, bajo el esquema de empresas mixtas en el desarrollo del plan de plena soberanía petrolera. Me parece importante ver el marco de la actuación de PDVSA dentro de las percepciones políticas del país, digamos, porque esto es uno de los puntos que tiene más controversia. Y esta es una encuesta que acaba de salir, me parece muy importante porque es la primera vez que se pregunta a la gente qué opinan de la labor de PDVSA. Digamos que uno de los consensos que existía, en la falta de consensos que existe en Venezuela, es que la política petrolera del gobierno venezolano es una política que goza de una gran aceptación y llama la atención los resultados de esta encuesta. Esta es una encuesta que el gobierno usa permanentemente, son encuestas pagadas por el gobierno, y la primera pregunta, ¿cómo administra PDVSA el petróleo venezolano? Bien, 30%, regular 31,4% y mal 32,9%. Aquí se muestra la polarización, digamos, si dividimos regular, y no es mayoritario, no, el consenso no está alrededor de que está mejor manejada la industria en este periodo. Y PDVSA hoy en día, en comparación con los gobiernos anteriores, con el presidente Chávez va mejor, 38%, peor 39%, igual 16%. Quiere decir que esto es un punto interesante porque este es el tema más agudo en la confrontación política nacional. ¿Cuáles son los temas de controversia? Uno, la capacidad de producción. En Venezuela pareciera que tenemos 2 PDVSA, según haya el análisis de la oposición y el análisis por parte del gobierno. Según la oposición, Venezuela tiene una caída de la producción que llega hasta 2,8 millones de barriles diarios. Según el gobierno, estamos produciendo 3,2 millones de barriles diarios. Después tenemos el tema de la solvencia financiera de la empresa. Aquí tenemos el tema del monto de la deuda interna y externa. Y la otra diferencia es la capacidad de endeudamiento. El sector de oposición dice que el endeudamiento de PDVSA es extremadamente alto, que se está hipotecando la capacidad financiera de la industria, y el gobierno aduce que si eso fuese así, no recibiría más financiamiento como el que está recibiendo, por ejemplo, ahorita de Japón, que va a ser un préstamo de 1.500 millones de dólares. Otro tema de controversia es el tema del lugar de PDVSA en el ranking de las empresas mundiales, tanto desde el punto de vista de producción como de operación. El otro tema que es uno de los temas mayores es la cantidad de reservas y producción de la faja del Orinoco. Como ustedes saben, antes de Chávez se hablaba de la faja bituminosa del Orinoco y hubo un cambio y se considera que lo que existe en la faja como reserva es petróleo extra pesado, pero petróleo y no bitumen. Y aquí está el proceso de certificación que está aceleradamente haciendo el gobierno venezolano desde el año 2007 para pasar de 172.000 millones de barriles de reservas probadas que tiene hoy a 316.000 millones en el caso de que sean incorporadas estas reservas de crudo extra pesado. El gobierno dice que no se está contando en la producción diaria la producción que existe de barriles de la faja, que el mismo gobierno tiene cifras que van de 600.000 barriles a 800.000. El tema de los empleados, el rol de la industria nacional. PDVSA, luego del paro petrolero y luego del despido de 20.000 técnicos superiores y de la alta nómina de PDVSA, quedó con 28.000 trabajadores en la industria. Hoy tiene 75.000 y gran parte de esta nueva mano de obra dentro de la empresa corresponde a las nacionalizaciones del año 2007 y a las nacionalizaciones de este año. Y existe una gran pugna desde el punto de vista político en Venezuela por la inclusión de nuevos trabajadores, porque no todos los trabajadores de las empresas nacionalizadas en mayo de este año han sido incorporados a la nómina de PDVSA. ¿Cuáles son los desafíos que tiene la empresa por delante, independientemente del grado de verdad que exista en las cifras o que exista en la gravedad de las vulnerabilidades o de los fortalecimientos? Uno es satisfacer el requerimiento de financiamiento, tanto para la conversión del petróleo pesado de la faja y adicionales para lograr potenciar los pozos viejos que existen en el occidente y en el oriente del país. También el financiamiento para inversiones en gas. El Ministerio de Energía y Minas y la propia PDVSA calcula que se requieren para los próximos 6 años 79.000 millones de dólares. Es una cifra que Venezuela no puede asumir por sí sola. Dos, el tema del recorte de gastos. De este año los gastos de PDVSA fueron reducidos en la mitad. El precio del petróleo venezolano fue estimado promedio para el año 2009 de $60 por barril. El Estado bajó esta tasa a $40 por barril y aunque se ha recuperado, todavía el promedio del año no llega a los $60 planteados. Esto significa un recorte de gastos en la industria alrededor de 50%, con una demanda de inclusión de los nuevos trabajadores petroleros que son de las empresas nacionalizadas. Está el tema de los compromisos crecientes en el área social. Uno de los temas de controversia en Venezuela, y esto es bastante paradójico, es que el monto de las asignaciones de PDVSA para el área social bajó. Y una de las críticas que existe ahorita dentro de la oposición es por qué bajó esta contribución al área social, cuando siempre desde la oposición se ha reclamado que PDVSA debería ser solamente una empresa petrolera y no incluir ni no desarrollar potencialidades en el área social, ya que eso le corresponde al Estado. Los compromisos crecientes de financiamiento del Estado venezolano, los compromisos externos en materia de creación y de construcción de refinerías en varios países de América Latina, el relacionamiento con el sector privado nacional e internacional. Existe una paradoja entre la promoción y la búsqueda de la promoción del desarrollo nacional con una industria aguas abajo venezolana que permita tener seguridad territorial para las inversiones venezolanas versus lo que acaba de pasar en términos de nacionalización. El tema del manejo de las tensiones geopolíticas por la búsqueda de nuevos socios energéticos petroleros, como es el caso de China, como es el caso de Rusia e Irán. El desafío del cambio de la matriz de consumo interno. Venezuela está consumiendo 600.000 barriles diarios de petróleo. La idea es cambiar la matriz de consumo a gas, pero para ello se tiene que desarrollar la potencialidad gasífera que tiene Venezuela en el oriente del país, lo cual requiere también inversiones que todavía no se han hecho y hay una demora importante. Y el tema de satisfacer compromisos con China y Japón. Venezuela se comprometió con China a exportar en el año 2010 1 millón de barriles de petróleo. Si en este momento está exportando 360, quiere decir que o aumenta la producción o deriva parte de la producción que esté exportándose a otros países Asia, China y Japón. Bueno, hasta aquí llego para. Gracias.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Institute for this kind invitation. I apologize if I'm making faces. I have a really bad sciatica that I cannot blame the trip. It happened just before I left. But anyhow, I have been asked to talk about Colombia, and having heard all the wonderful presentation early on about Mexico, Brazil, and Venezuela, well, we can see that Colombia have gone through a lot of those issues that were presented or Brazil might be facing in the future, but with less extremes. But still, I think there is a lot to be learned from the Colombian experience, and that's what I hope we can discuss today. The first thing that we need to see is that there is something to be said about what they call obsolescence bargain. Basically, the idea is that there is a different level of relationship between the governments and the foreign companies, oil companies in this case, when they are looking at policies and contracts. And Colombia is a very good example of that. Initially, the country was unknown geologically and very attractive for foreign companies. And as the discoveries and the private companies started doing their job and the discoveries started to occur, the government started to change the rules of the game, and it was very difficult for the companies to react because some investments were already made. They had some stranded assets, but eventually they were starting to respond toward the future, saying, well, we're not going to expose our risk. So this trend is something that has been common in Colombia, which I think is a key point here. The myth that the contracts in Colombia and the investor security and all those things that the current administration keeps talking, it was not always present in Colombian petroleum history. And let's look at the Colombian petroleum history very briefly. We can divide basically in three periods. First, the early days from 1918 to 1970, and basically I copied that from a wonderful paper recently published by the Universidad de los Andes. I have a little bit disagreement in terms of the period, but I think for simplicity, let's keep the dates. And in the early days, Colombia had a concession model. The terms were very attractive, and the foreign companies were the game in town, particularly Exxon. And the model that it was developed was the enclave model. So the oil companies basically went to Colombia to find oil, produce oil, and to export it to the U.S. market or more profitable markets. They basically ignored the domestic market. So very little relationship between the development of the reserves and production and the development of the country. During that period, large discoveries were made, and the big concession, the Mares, Barco, etc. And in overall, during those years, more than 5 billion barrels of oil reserve were added. As discoveries started to pile up, the country started to rethink its petroleum policy, and in tune with what was happening in the region, it became a little bit more nationalistic, but nationalistic in the sense of industrialization, and a concept that sometimes, for example, Venezuela talk about resource nationalism is nothing really new. It has been around in Latin America for years. And in the 50s, Colombia wanted to develop their industry, to industrialize, and they started with the energy side, and they created Ecopetrol. The nationalization, in reality, didn't occur in Colombia. What happened is a transfer of the reserve of the concession from the private companies to the state oil company. The government said, well, in such and such years, your concession is going to end, and we're going to renew it. We're going to take over those assets. And after that, we saw a progression in terms of tightening terms and a move towards soft resource nationalism. And that's what happened between 1970 to 1994. And interestingly, that's when Colombia became a net oil importer. The contracts were very difficult. That's the era when we have the association contracts, 50-50. Basically, the companies had to carry all the exploration risk, and if a discovery was made, they were forced to partner with Ecopetrol, and Ecopetrol would just partner in terms of put their capital regarding the production, and all exploration was up to the private company. And any production was supposed to be shared 50-50, and in addition to that, you have to pay royalties and taxes. And obviously, those conditions were really difficult, and very little exploration occurred. As Colombia was a net oil importer, and these contracts were in place, it was required to make the contracts a little bit more attractive. Despite the difficulty of those contracts, exploration continued in Colombia because, as I said, companies had already some commitments and some stranded assets, some obligations to fulfill. And it's because of those obligations we see some large discoveries in the 80s and early 90s. And that's when we have Caño Limón and Cusiana. The fields were significantly big, 500 million barrels in average, and around 5 billion barrels of oil reserve were added during this period. With these discoveries, the trend that was initially started modestly in terms of improving the terms, Ecopetrol started to share the risk, recognizing some of the exploration efforts, trying to attract investment to move from this import situation. The terms tighten again, so there is a reserve of policy, and we go to a model called the R factor. And that's when really there is a collapse in the oil exploration activity in Colombia. Because that coincides with the low oil prices that we had in the early 90s. As Ana Maria mentioned, Venezuela was selling oil at $7. Average WTI was around 18 to 20. But also it coincided with the high cost of doing business in Colombia. Politically, the country was going through a very difficult period. The security situation was a significant problem for many oil companies in Colombia. And the tax, in addition, increased because the government imposed what they call the war tax. And that's when, if you remember, Colombia was sometimes called as potential failed state. And eventually, the country come to the realization that this was not sustainable, and the rapid decline in reserve, it was going to lead to the difficult situation of becoming a net oil importer. A key driver on the oil policies in Colombia is the risk of becoming a net oil importer. And so they started again to work on the fiscal terms. They start tinkering again some of the conditions, trying to attract more investment. Eventually, they said, enough, we really need to redefine our petroleum policy. We're going to do something completely different. We're going to be really, really aggressive, and we're going to send a signal to the market promoting a complete set of policies. And that's what they have done since 2004 to 2008. They create a new regulator, the Agencia Nacional de Hidrocarburos, and we have seen an exploration boom, but despite that, very modest discoveries. This is pretty much the type of oil reserve that we have been discovered through the years in Colombia. And the key point here is that the big oil in Colombia has already been found. And what's left, according to many geologists and geophysicists, is tend to be smaller or very expensive to develop. The other key issue to understand about Colombia is the importance of oil in Colombia. Although the country is not as dependent as Venezuela or Mexico in terms of oil for its economic growth, it really has an important role to play in the balance trade and in the fiscal balance. In terms of oil role in the Colombian economy is around 3.5%. It's not something to ignore, but it's not what really drives the economy. But in terms of export, is the main source of hard currency, and also is the main source of fiscal revenue. How does oil impact the fiscal income? First of all, Ecopetrol payment of dividends, the royalty and taxes paid by the oil companies, the transfer of the petroleum fund, something that Ecopetrol was in charge but is not in charge anymore. In 2008, 76% of the increase of government revenues were due to oil rent. And in the last 10 years, we have seen that all the transfer of rents from the oil sector account for something like 2% of GDP per year. And royalties is the main source of income from the regions where oil is produced. So that's basically the livelihood. But one of the key issues is that traditionally Colombia has had a reputation of good fiscal management. The country has been proud, and I remember when I was studying economics in Colombia, some of the professors who were involved with the government said, well, you know, we have a lot of problems, but we have always had a very good fiscal management. We have never had a debt default, and many of the problems that affected Latin America in the 80s were not, Colombia was kind of the exception. All that ended in the 90s, and it's interesting to question why. What happened in the 90s that we throw outside all these years of fiscal conservative and discipline? Few things happen. One is that, first of all, we had an initial short coffee boom, which really didn't last very much. The second one, we had the impact of the drug trade and the cocaine economy, which started to really create a consumption-driven economy. But the third one is all the big discoveries that were made in the late 80s and early 90s, Caño Limón and Cusiana, which really created the thinking that Colombia was going to become an oil economy like Venezuela, that Colombia would have the potential of becoming, if not as big, perhaps significant bigger than what it really is in terms of oil, and oil was going to be a long-term supplier of revenues to the country. And that coincided with the increase in social problems, as I described, with the conflict and the recession in 1991-92. So despite significant oil revenues, because of initially because of production and then later because of prices, we can see in the green light that Colombia has always been in a deficit situation. So what's the problem right now? That right now we are on an economic situation where the government has the tight very hand in terms of fiscal policy. The government cannot really do very much in terms of softening the blow of the global economic recession, because they really don't have the tools. Why? Because they have all this deficit situation that they inherit from the mismanagement of the oil booms of the 90s. And basically that's what we have. We can see that the recession in 1991-92 was significant for Colombia, and that's when basically all the discipline that the country had went out of the window. One possibility, one of the problems that result of that recession, which was very short-lived but very deep, is the new constitution, the 1991 constitution. At the time, Colombia was looking to improve or deepen its democratic institutions. They thought, well, one of our problems is that there is not enough representation in the country, and we need to make the regions more accountable. And in order to make them more accountable, we're going to make more democratic. So we're going to have mayors elected, governors elected, and also they're going to be having access to the federal, to the national budget and control their own rent. That was a wonderful idea, with the problem that many of those regions were not prepared technically to manage those revenues. And second, those regions also created a straitjacket to the budget, and Colombia's budget is one of the most limited in terms of the allocations. Basically, the money comes in and is already allocated, so the government really has very limited policy room, as I said, to address some of the problems that we're facing with the global economic recession. So, facing that, we see that the government was required to really break from the past in terms of energy policy, and what they did, I think, is it was very courageous, very gutsy, if you want, in terms of moving from many of the taboos that were common in the 80s and the 90s. For example, the non-concession. one of the key problems was and continue to be is the fear to lose the export status, because that could have severe trade balance difficulties. One of the situation in the old model was that Ecopetrol was supposed to be the company that kept all the expertise, and it was a forced partner for all the private companies and also a player and a referee. And the minister was a weak policy making institution. The minister tend to be something as always behind and dependent on Ecopetrol expertise in order to whatever policies were supposed to be made. In reality, the policies were made at Ecopetrol. And the Ecopetrol didn't have the incentive to be an efficient or competitive company, because its success depended from the private companies. Since you were a forced partner, any discovery that the private company made was your discovery by 50%. So you didn't really have to work very hard to add reserves. And also the government was reluctant to allocate large sum of revenue to the national company, because they didn't trust their ability, and also because traditional governments are, rightly so, risk averse, and the oil business is a very high risk business. Political risk and low oil price and high government take made Colombia unattractive, and the national oil company was also unable to invest, because it was also subject to the government pressures. You know, the budget was used to other things. So what did they do? The first thing they did is they broke the whole system. They created a ministry, and a ministry, the role of the ministry is to set up the policies. Then they created the regulatory entity, Agencia Nacional de Hidrocarburos, which job is to manage the contracts. So they manage the oil wealth of the country, and the Ecopetrol is just another oil company that is mandated to explore and produce oil like any other oil company in Colombia. The second thing they did was to really send a market signal in terms of government take. They really reduced the royalties, the taxes, in a way beyond what would have been expected in this balance between reserves and government take. And they did that in purpose. Traditionally, the more oil you have, the higher you're charged in terms of royalties and taxes to capture the rent. You know, Saudi Arabia has plenty of oil and is very low cost, and they obviously have a government take of 100%. Venezuela government take is around 90-95%. Libya 98-95%. Chile, Ireland are very, very low government take. Why? Because the geological risk is extremely high. So Colombia, so there is this relationship between geological potential and government take, or the share of the government petroleum rent. And Colombia reduced that beyond what would have been in equilibrium, if you want. And they did that in purpose because they really wanted to send a signal to the marketplace. And they did that by offering really attractive terms in terms of royalties. They reduced royalties going from 5 to 25%, and they created a contract that is much more attractive in terms of the stability of the clauses and all the other issues that are key to private investors. Despite the increasing prices in the last few years, Colombia maintained its position, and they said we're going to maintain this position of being very attractive, having low royalties, low taxes, because we wanted to make sure that investors trust our policies, even though all the neighbors were doing exactly the opposite. And finally, and I said finally because I remember doing business in Colombia with Canadian companies, and it was a nightmare to have Ecopetrol and the ministry recognize that the key issue was security. Finally, the government recognized they have a security problem, and that was a problem for oil companies. And so every time they started to address the security issue in front. In terms of the oil side, the security was a key problem because of the pipelines being blown up all the time, and also because of the kidnap, and finally because of the loss of production. The country created a mobile unit who were financed through Plan Colombia and some contribution from the oil industry, to make sure that the infrastructure was protected, and that has really produced a significant change in terms of security. However, I think in the last few, maybe couple of years, we have seen that the situation is, if not reversing, is becoming a little bit more complicated. one should not ignore the security issues in Colombia. For example, in Arauca, which is one of the oil-rich regions of Colombia, there is heavy fighting between FARC and ELN and government military forces. And in Putumayo, oil companies are dealing with the problem that had nothing to do with the guerrilla, but has everything to do with the Ponzi scheme that was created by a businessman from Putumayo, but also has to do mostly with the drug trafficking in that region. Also, the government offered new areas of opportunities in terms of concessions, and it creates a very ambitious risk in terms of production. And the most ambitious one is that Colombia wants to reach almost 1 million barrels sometime in the next 10 to 20 years. In terms of investments, those are significant. The country will, in order to meet those goals of adding 4 or 5 billion barrels of oil reserves and reaching 1 million barrels production by 2020, they would need to invest around $2.5 to $2.6 billion per year in the next 20-25 years. One of the areas where the oil is going to come from is the heavy crude oil. Obviously, the oil potential in the heavy crude oil in Colombia is not like the Orinoco. It's not a significant high, but it has two advantages. One is the oil, although it's heavy, is not as heavy as the Orinoco, and obviously it's not as difficult as the tar sand in Canada. So it has some qualities that has an impact on cost. The country believes that the heavy crude oil is where the future of Colombia is, and the marketplace has responded. Many private oil companies were active bidding in the last round for the heavy crude oil projects. Ecopetrol has a new role. It is now forced to compete, and I think this is a key issue. Sometimes I'm often asked by government officials in other countries who are wondering, what do we do with our national oil company? So what made the Ecopetrol case viable or successful so far is the credibility that the current administration, I think, and that's my personal thinking, would have not hesitated to sell the company if the company was not willing to, was not able to provide the results that were expected. Because at the end of the day, the company was almost at the situation where they were going to become a liability in terms of revenues. So I think that really put a lot of pressure on the team of Ecopetrol to say, well, we really need to work our act together. But they did two things to help them to achieve that. One is financial independence. One of the key problems for many national oil companies in Latin America is they are dependent on the budget. But now, by allowing the company to manage its own finance, basically by going to the international market, they don't really have to become a burden or a risk to the national budget. And also, by doing that, they basically created some kind of a democratic capitalism. And finally, Colombians are really involved in terms of Ecopetrol and following the success or lack of success of the company very closely, because it's affecting their pocket, contrary to the more nationalistic slogan. Now they know exactly what is happening and if it's helping them or not. The Ecopetrol has a very ambitious project. They want to reach 1 million barrels inside and outside Colombia. And for that, they recognize that the country alone might not be able to provide that potential, so they're looking for other areas, and it's the first time Ecopetrol is allowed to go outside the country. They're investing in Peru, they're in Brazil, and they are in the Gulf of Mexico, and there were even rumors that they wanted to do some exploration in Cuba. As I said, the financial independence of Ecopetrol is perhaps one of the significant achievements in terms of the new policy. And in terms of the market, I think the market responded. Colombia initially became the destination from the junior oil company. So basically, anybody who was born in Calgary called in February. They took a flight to Cartagena, and they really loved the conference that La Agencia Nacional de Hidrocarburos threw there. But it was a good timing, because during those years, I'm talking about 2003, 2004, 2005, the market had an excess of money. As somebody, an investor once told me, there is more money than ideas here. So if you come up with a good product, you could really raise capital and create your own company. And that was happening in Calgary, and I think it was happening also in the US. And that coincided with the deteriorating terms in Alberta. So the companies were facing more difficult investment environment back home, and they were looking for opportunities outside. And also deteriorating conditions in countries that, in theory, should be more attractive in terms of oil, like Venezuela or Ecuador. The early successes of companies like Petrominerales or Petrorubiales or Gran Tierra, etc., really started to attract the larger companies, independent companies like Talisman, and eventually the big boys like Exxon and Shell, who now are coming back to Colombia. Still, the industry is heavily dominated by Ecopetrol, is by far the largest player, and a very large number of really small players. I think that this large number of players are facing serious difficulties right now because a lot of them were over-leveraged financially, and they might not be able to honor all their obligations. So one would expect a period of consolidation in terms of the industry. I think one of the missing part of this story is that there is not enough Colombian capital. The capital, the risk taker are still Canadians and Americans and some Europeans, but there are not that many Colombians. There are some Venezuelans too who were involved with the previous administration and are bringing their knowledge to Colombia. In terms of exploration, we see that there is an exploration boom going on in Colombia. Again, that's the response of oil prices opportunities, but also the fiscal terms. In 2008 is the year where more oil exploration wells were drilled in the last 20-25 years in Colombia, but not significant discoveries. So just to sum up, Colombian petroleum policy has been successful at attracting investment and postponing the risk of becoming a net oil importing country. And there is potential for significant windfall revenues if all this heavy crude oil story becomes a reality, or if a new discovery is made, because we never know. You know, there is still a lot of land in Colombia to be explored. But in if that happened, I think that one should be cautious, because in the past Colombia has been known to mismanage its oil bonanzas and its coffee bonanzas. And the current fiscal discipline, although it's positive, is creating a social risk, because the country is really having a really high level of unemployment and a lot of social tension. So the pressure to use any oil bonanza, if they were to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, would be significant. Local private capital participation in the industry is still too modest, although there is a lot of players, many of them are foreign. The industry, despite large in numbers of participants, is concentrated in few hands, and Ecopetrol is by far the largest player. And that's creating a problem in terms of bottlenecks, because Ecopetrol doesn't have the incentive to increase the transportation infrastructure, and some of the smaller players are complaining about that. And the smaller players don't have the money to build all those pipelines. The country should work further in developing a local market for general companies. I think that should be a key issue. And also, I think it's necessary to pay attention to the social and environmental issues. Although no big brand companies are involved, they're coming back, and I think that's going to create more pressure in terms of the social tension that still exists in Colombia around the oil industry. And this is, before coming, I wanted I asked an oil investor who's operating in Colombia, and I asked a question. From your perspective, what's positive and what's missing or need improvement in Colombia? And this is what he said. He likes the fiscal terms. They could be better, always. That they have a transparent, efficient system to provide land. The regulations are really good, and the contract stability is something that the investment community starts to believe. But the areas where we see problem is the environmental permits is too long. They really need to work on the security along the border region, particularly in the Putumayo area. Improve the pipeline integrity, so because of security problem, and also increase social development. So I think the story is a success story in terms of the business, but I think Colombia needs to pay more attention in terms of the social and environmental issues. Thank you very much.
We've had two terrific presentations, but the hour is late, and it is, after all, the month of July. So I'd like to take a couple of questions together, perhaps in one single round, and then break for the rest of the day. Questions for Ana Maria or for Roger, you can ask in any language, and we will call on our able translators. Sure, this gentleman, you.
Joe Dugert, I'm an independent energy analyst. My question is for Roger, and it's about the map you showed of the Gulf. You said that Ecopetrol had diversified by going into some foreign areas. It looked, you showed the map only very briefly, but it looked to me as if those dots or X's were in deep water. And if Colombia is capital short, I wonder what sort of arrangements were made that allowed Ecopetrol to invest in that type of exploration.
My understanding is
Roger,
that
excuse me. Let's take a couple more questions, and then we can have a set of responses. I actually have a question for Ana Maria. ¿En inglés? ¿Está bien?
Está bien.
Okay. You described, I think, the critical framework for understanding Chavez's approach to Venezuelan oil and PDVSA, which is that it is not viewed in commercial terms, it's viewed in strategic terms. And so my question, I guess, is at what point does the commercial non-viability of the oil industry run the risk of undermining the achievement of the strategic objectives? Because I think most of the discussion, certainly in Washington, and among former PDVSA employees and people who left after the 2003 strike, is one of lack of investment, deteriorating infrastructure, lower levels of production, the export of unreasonable levels of oil outside of Venezuela. And so my question is, how do you see the interplay between the PDVSA as a company, as a viable company, in support of strategic objectives, and the use of oil, as a form of projection? Any other questions? Well, I actually have. I'm sorry. Sure, right here. Could you wait for the microphone? Thanks.
Yes, Jorge Kamine with Skadden Arps. Maybe for Roger, but equally for Ana Maria, although I'm not sure she touched on this. But Roger, there's quite an experience in Colombia with the decentralization, and you touched on this, of oil revenues and how that's impacted development. In fact, your last bullet on this last slide talks about that. We also heard about maybe a re-examination of that in the case of Brazil. And, of course, there's the case of Mexico, which we heard. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe speak about that and that role. And, again, equally relevant for Venezuela.
If I could just put one last question on the table, I guess, for both of you. It has to do with the diversification of the export markets. Question for Ana Maria: has Chavez been successful in diversifying the foreign buyers of the oil produced in Venezuela, which is unique in terms of the heavy crude, particularly reduce the reliance on the United States? And Roger, what, if any, plans are there to diversify the markets for Colombian oil, particularly if Ecopetrol is successful in partnering with or looking for oil outside of Colombia, per se, and partnering with other oil companies?
Okay. In terms of the Gulf of Mexico, as I understand, Colombia is not going to be the operator. It's going to partnered and has partnered with companies like Petrobras and Anadarko. And basically what they're doing is what many oil, mid-sized oil companies do. They enter with a bigger player and they learn the process. And the thinking is, if we learn how to do this where there is a lot of experience, expertise, then we can apply that in our deep water in the Atlantic, but also in the Pacific. In terms of decentralization, I think one of the key challenges that Colombia had is the weak institutionalization, institutions, especially at the regional level. And that's common in many places in Latin America. I know in Peru they are struggling with that problem too. Even in Colombia, although the country claims to be very democratic and having very strong institutions, when you go outside the main cities, the politics of electing people, it's usually through the guns. You know, in the area where the paramilitaries are in charge, people vote for whoever is supported by the paramilitaries. In area where the FARC are in charge, people vote for whoever is in the FARC wants to vote. And often now, some of the guerrilla are not fighting against the oil companies or these evil imperialists. They are fighting to capture the rents that by law need to go to those areas. I know that the government has been changing some of the legislation trying to control that, because basically the taxes were subsidizing the FARC, which was a little bit absurd. So I think that's one of the problems of decentralization. I think it's a good idea, but it's one that needs more thinking if you don't have good institutions. In terms of diversifying markets, well, basically the government doesn't have a set strategy. You know, the companies decide where to sell the oil. But echoing one of the companies that last week they were in Cartagena talking about this, they said Colombia could have the opportunity to take over what Venezuela is giving up, which is the Gulf of Mexico, because the relationship that the PDVSA built with Shell and other companies in the Gulf of Mexico is, you produce the oil, the heavy crude oil, we refine it where the market is. In terms of the market logic, it makes a lot of sense. The problem, it didn't make too much sense in terms of the development for Venezuela, because basically none of the interior Venezuela ever developed. But all the refineries were built and set to process Venezuelan crude. Since Chavez doesn't want to send that oil there anymore, right now the Canadians are taking over that market, but Colombia could become a very aggressive player if the numbers are there. And the one question that I remember I teased the other day in a conference in Calgary, there is a company called Enbridge. It's a big pipeline company in Canada, and they used to have assets in Colombia. They sold that mostly for financial reasons, nothing to do with geopolitics or anything like that. Enbridge has been working for years on a pipeline that would eventually move heavy crude oil, the tar sand, from northern Alberta to British Columbia and to export to the Chinese market. It's a 2,000-kilometer pipeline, something like that, and it's a very expensive, difficult project with a lot of environmental issues, indigenous issues. And I remember I approached one of the Ecopetrol executives and said, well, would you have any problem building a pipeline, especially since the pipeline is almost built, which would allow to do the same thing, moving Venezuelan crude oil to Colombia and exporting to China? And that would really reduce the transportation cost. I said, absolutely not. We would be more than happy to do that because, well, we get a tariff. So I think if it makes good business sense, they would do it. It's a question to see if both countries could agree on that. I know they are trying to, at the technical level, they're in conversation, but I don't know if they're at the political level.
Sí, por favor. Bueno, en relación a la pregunta sobre cuánto podría durar esta estrategia de PDVSA, aquí es muy importante señalar que el cambio de la política venezolana en términos de mayor uso del petróleo como palanca política interna y externamente estuvo correlacionada con el alza de los precios del petróleo. Es decir, nosotros estamos gozando del periodo que estuvo entre el año 2003 y el último trimestre de 2008. A partir del último trimestre del 2008, me parece a mí que es el test case de PDVSA y de la política nacional en relación a esto, en el sentido de si va a haber incentivos para que cambie esta política de PDVSA. Sin embargo, si nosotros tomamos lo que ha sucedido desde el último trimestre del 2008 hasta ahora en relación a los convenios que ha hecho Venezuela, pareciera que no va a haber ningún cambio independientemente de que exista menos ganancia. Porque, digamos, el año pasado fue el año de mayor ganancia de PDVSA porque los precios del petróleo llegaron a límites estratosféricos. El precio del petróleo venezolano llegó a estar en $100, que para Venezuela era lo más alto. PDVSA el año pasado ganó $140.000 millones. Y ya este año se está preparando para una ganancia menor, pero en términos hay dos cosas importantes aquí. Una es el tema de integración y de Petrocaribe, que lo va a seguir manteniendo, y otro es el tema de seguridad. O sea, Venezuela ha nacionalizado las empresas por un tema de seguridad territorial y seguridad nacional, y también para mantener el control financiero por la especulación. Entonces me parece que a corto plazo no hay un cambio de estrategia y solamente sería que PDVSA diera pérdidas. Ahora, hay una gran controversia nacional sobre si existen pérdidas o no de PDVSA. En relación a la diversificación de mercados, lo que decía Roger es muy pertinente. Venezuela tiene la intención por el tema de seguridad frente a Estados Unidos, sobre todo frente a la administración Bush, de dejar de vender petróleo a Estados Unidos porque no sabía en qué momento Estados Unidos podía dejar de comprarle petróleo por un tema político. El gran problema de la migración de mercados de Venezuela tiene que ver con la capacidad de refinación del petróleo de Venezuela, porque aquí hay 5 refinerías que están especializadas en el petróleo venezolano, y justo la mayor debilidad en los proyectos de integración ha sido la construcción de refinerías. Nosotros tenemos una historia de construcción de una refinería con Brasil, que tenemos 5 años, entre las cuales PDVSA y Petrobras inventan todas las historias y los presidentes discuten, amenazan a los presidentes de las empresas en público y nadie sabe por qué no ha sido posible construir una refinería que está pautada. Venezuela ha acordado en convenios con países de América Latina aproximadamente entre 12 y 15 refinerías. El presidente Chávez, donde va, promete una refinería para incentivar la diversificación de mercados, pero esto ha sido muy complicado. Digamos, aquí hay hipótesis sobre discapacidad de PDVSA de hacerlo, cambios en la línea sobre las inversiones, discapacidad financiera para poder hacerlo, pero la más concreta, que es la refinería Abreu de Lima, es el caso de que hay una disposición política de ambas empresas para construirla, pero hay desavenencias comerciales porque Venezuela quiere mantener el 60% de el ingreso y de la empresa, y Petrobras no acepta eso, y ahí están las consecuencias, ¿no? Y en el tema de la descentralización, en el caso de Venezuela hay una reversión de ese tema, digamos, hay una recentralización del manejo de PDVSA, e inclusive la posibilidad del uso de empresas nacionales aguas abajo, no ya en la exploración y en la explotación de petróleo, sino en todo lo que es la industria derivada, ha sufrido un golpe muy importante con las nacionalizaciones ocurridas en este último mes de mayo.
Okay. If there are no further questions, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our speakers. Thanks to all of you for your interest and attention. And we will end the session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.